Hidden in the shadowy corridors of history lies the chilling tale of Elizabeth Báthory, a name whispered with equal parts fear and fascination. Known as the Blood Countess, her story unfolds in the dark heart of the 16th century Hungary, a time of superstition, power, and unspeakable horror. Was she a sadistic killer driven by vanity and cruelty, or a victim of political conspiracy? Tonight, we delve into the life and legend of one of history's most infamous figures, separating the truth from the macabre myths that have haunted her name for centuries. She was born into wealth, power, and privilege, a child of one of Europe's most influential noble families. But beneath the glittering facade of grandeur lurked a darkness so profound it would transcend centuries. Elizabeth Báthory, feared by the peasants, whispered about in hushed tones by the nobility, and immortalized as one of history's most horrifying figures. Some say she bathed in blood, others that she murdered to satisfy a sinister obsession. But who was she? A predator whose shadow consumed hundreds of innocent lives? Or a woman ensnared by the ambitions of those around her? Let's journey into the heart of a legend, peeling back the layers of myth and fear to uncover the truth, or what remains of it. To understand Elizabeth Báthory, we must begin where her story takes root, in a world of power, war, and ruthless ambition. Elizabeth Báthory was born on August 7th of 1560 in the town of Nyírbátor, Hungary. Her family, the Bathorys, was among the most powerful in Eastern Europe. Warriors, politicians, and rulers who command vast estates and wielded influence over nations. Yet, with power came a shadow. Her lineage was rife with whispers of mental instability, cruelty, and darkness. Her uncle dabbled in the occult, performing forbidden rituals. Her aunt was notorious for acts of sadistic pleasure. Elizabeth grew up in this world of grandeur and chaos, an intelligent and striking child who would one day learn to command the respect of kings and fear of peasants. But her childhood was not untouched by suffering. She suffered from violent seizures, likely epilepsy. In those times, treatments for such afflictions were as brutal as they were superstitious, and blood was often part of the cure. Whether these experiences shaped her future or whether she carried a darkness all her own is something that history cannot answer. But one thing is certain: her early years were marked by privilege, pain, and the seeds of what was to come. At the age of 15, Elizabeth was married to Count Nadasdy, a soldier known as the Black Knight of Hungary for his brutal campaigns against the Ottoman Turks. Their marriage was a union of two powerful families, solidifying their status as one of the most formidable houses in the region. Elizabeth moved into Castle Jacquete, a towering fortress that would become both her home and her prison. While her husband fought on the front lines, Elizabeth was left to manage their vast estates. She was no mere figurehead. Elizabeth was shrewd, commanding, and unafraid to exercise her authority. To those who served her, she was both revered and feared. Tales of her temper began to spread, whispers of cruelty that would soon take on a life of their own. With the death of her husband in 1604, Elizabeth's power grew unchecked. She was now the sole ruler of her estates, overseeing wealth and lands that spanned across Hungary. But it was also during this time that the stories began to change. Whispers became accusations, and accusations became terror. Servants spoke of Elizabeth's twisted punishments. Needles driven beneath fingernails, girls stripped naked and smeared with honey before being left to the mercy of insects. In the winter, victims were drenched in freezing water and left outside to freeze to death. But the most disturbing rumors spoke of blood. It was said that Elizabeth believed that the blood of young girls could preserve her beauty. Though the infamous tale of bathing in blood was likely a later invention, the accounts of mutilated bodies and blood-drained corpses cannot be ignored. For years, Elizabeth's cruelty was overlooked. The lives of peasants and servants were deemed expendable. But when noble families began sending their daughters to her castle for education, and those daughters began disappearing, the veil of protection that she enjoyed began to lift. By 1610, the stories had reached King Matthias II. He ordered Count Georgi Thurzo, a trusted nobleman, to investigate. On December 29, 1610, Thurzo arrived at Castle Chakite unannounced, and what he found would haunt him forever. The Countess was arrested that night, along with her most trusted servants. Her accomplices would later confess, some under torture, to burying the remains of as many as 650 victims. The true number remains unknown, but even the lowest estimates are staggering. Elizabeth Báthory never stood trial herself. Her noble status shielded her from public judgment. But her servants were not so fortunate. They were tortured, condemned, and executed in brutal fashion. Elizabeth, however, was sentenced to a far different fate. She was confined to a single room within her castle. Its windows were bricked up to ensure that she would never escape. For 4 years, she lived in isolation, her once grand life reduced to shadows and whispers. On August 21st, 1614, Elizabeth Báthory was found dead in her makeshift cell. She was 54 years old. Some say she died peacefully in her sleep. Others claim that her mind unraveled in her final days, tormented by the ghost of her victims. Elizabeth Báthory's name has become a legend, some claiming her to be the most prolific female murderer in history. Others insist she was the victim of a political conspiracy, her wealth and power making her a target for those who sought to claim her lands. What cannot be denied is the horror of her legacy. Whether the tales of bloodbaths and 650 victims are fact or fiction, the fear that she inspired endures. She has been immortalized as the Blood Countess, a figure as haunting as the cold walls of Castle Chakite itself. Elizabeth Báthory's name is synonymous with cruelty, but was she truly the monster that history made her out to be? Or was she the victim of greed, politics, fear? For centuries, historians and scholars have debated the validity of the charges leveled against her. The evidence, while gruesome, is fraught with inconsistencies and ulterior motives. Could the Blood Countess have been framed? At the heart of the case lies a web of political intrigue. Elizabeth Báthory was one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Hungary, a Protestant in a kingdom increasingly dominated by Catholic Habsburg rule. Her extensive estates and noble lineage posed a threat to King Matthias II, and owed her family a substantial debt, one that conveniently just disappeared after her arrest. Could her downfall have been orchestrated to seize her wealth and silence her influence? And Thurzo, the man who arrested Elizabeth, was not just an investigator, he was also a rival. His family stood to gain politically and financially from her disgrace. He controlled every aspect of the trial, from gathering evidence to silencing dissenters. And what of the witnesses? Of the 289 testimonies collected, most were hearsay. Only a handful claimed to have seen the alleged atrocities firsthand, and those accounts were inconsistent. Some spoke of victims buried in unmarked graves, but no mass graves were ever found. The confessions that damned Elizabeth came from her servants, 4 individuals who were arrested, tortured, and executed shortly after. Under duress, they claimed to have buried dozens of bodies and acted on Elizabeth's orders. But how reliable is testimony extracted under torture? Can we trust the words of those who were desperate to save themselves, even at the cost of their mistress's life? One of the most damning pieces of evidence, a ledger supposedly listing 650 victims, was never presented in court. Its existence was mentioned by a servant, but the ledger itself was never found. Was it real, or just another fabrication in the case against her? Elizabeth Báthory was not an ordinary noblewoman. She was highly educated, politically savvy, and unafraid to assert her authority in a male-dominated society. Could her strength have been her undoing? In an era when powerful women were often vilified, Elizabeth's independence may have made her an easy target. Stories of witches and temptresses were already entrenched in the collective imagination. Could her reputation have been twisted to fit these archetypes? The most infamous part of Elizabeth's legend, the bloodbaths, is almost certainly a fabrication. This tale did not appear until over a century after her death, popularized by folklore and sensationalized accounts. By the 18th century, Elizabeth had become less of a historical figure and more of a mythical monster, immortalized in stories of vampires and dark rituals. These embellishments, while captivating, have muddied the waters of truth. What remains of Elizabeth Báthory's life is a fractured mosaic of fact and fiction. Was she a sadistic killer, orchestrating the torture and murder of hundreds? Or was she a powerful woman whose wealth and influence made her a target in a ruthless political game? We may never know the full truth. What we do know is this: Elizabeth Báthory was silenced, her lands taken, her story twisted into a legend that continues to haunt us. In death, she became the monster her enemies needed her to be. Elizabeth Báthory's story is a mirror, reflecting both the horrors of humanity and the power of myth. It is a reminder that history is not just written in ink, but in fear, ambition, and blood.